Ah, children, gather around. Today I'm going to tell you the story of a forgotten discovery. It's a tale from a time when the winds, salty seas, and brave hearts echoed. Back in the age of great kings, warriors, and explorers, there were the Vikings, who sailed to the ends of the world. These men, who trusted their courage more than their swords and made friends with the storms, were fearless souls searching for new lands across the vast, cold northern seas. And among them there was one who was different from the rest. His name was Leif Erikson. Now let me tell you about his adventure. Leif Erikson was the man who sailed beyond the known world, using his courage to cross the North Sea. His father, Eric the Red, was the man who discovered the ice-covered land of Greenland, but Leif's eyes were set on something further. According to the stories, the whispers of the wind and fate promised him a new land. This land was called Vinland, a fertile place in a completely different world. But how is it that the Vikings set foot in America 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus? What were they looking for? What did they find? And why did they leave these lands behind? To find the answers to these questions, we'll peel back the mists of time. Are you ready, my children? Then, without further delay, let's listen to the wind and set sail into Leif Erikson's unknown adventures. Come closer, my children. Today I'm going to tell you the story of a people who didn't just make history with their swords, but also with their courage. Born in the cold lands of the north, between fog-covered fjords, these people were not just warriors, they were also traders, craftsmen, and most importantly, sailors with a spirit of exploration. They were the Vikings, and know this, for a Viking, exploring didn't just mean finding new lands. Exploration was a part of their very soul. Scandinavian lands, long winter nights, harsh winds, and seas that never stopped roaring. Anyone born here had to face the sea at some point in their life. Even their legends were intertwined with the seas. Odin's wisdom, Thor's thunder, Njord's waves, all the gods left their mark in their lives. But their greatest inspiration came from their ancestors. Every Viking youth, raised listening to tales of their grandfathers' and fathers' adventures, was eager to live out their own journey one day. The sea to the Scandinavian people was not a barrier but a gateway. Their land was harsh and farming was difficult, but the sea, it always offered new opportunities. So, the Vikings began using the seas as a pathway to discover new lands. First to the shores of Britain, then to Frankish lands, and later to distant Iceland, Greenland, and a place no one knew, Vinland. This adventure was a burden only brave hearts could bear. But remember, my children, these long journeys couldn't be done with just an ordinary boat. And this is where one of the greatest features that set the Vikings apart from other peoples comes into play. The longships. These ships were marvels of engineering. Light, fast, and durable against the ocean's waves. They could be assembled in just a few days and rebuilt in another river. They could adapt to both deep waters and shallow rivers. The longship was one of the greatest secrets that allowed the Vikings to explore the world. Now, how did the passion for discovery in a Viking's heart push them to new worlds? What stories planted the seeds for Leif Erikson and his great journey? Well, the real adventure begins now. Are you ready? My children, before a traveler sets foot on new lands, they must first understand the land they were born in. Because when a person forgets where they came from, they can't really know where they're going. That's why before we dive into Leif Erikson's great adventure, we need to understand his roots. His courage came not only from his own will, but also from his blood. And in his blood there was a call from the seas, the storms, and the forbidden lands. Leif was no ordinary man's son. His father was a man who struck fear even with his name, Eric the Red, Kizil Eric. We can't skip over talking about him. Having a father like him was both a great honor and a heavy burden for a son. He was not only a brave warrior, but also a fearless explorer. And most importantly, he was the first man among the Vikings to find a new world. But Eric the Red's life wasn't always a conquest story. He didn't live an easy life. Born in Norway, his family was exiled due to a murder, so he had to travel with his family to Iceland. For Vikings, exile was nearly as bad as death. But the blood flowing through Kjell Erik's veins wasn't ordinary. He saw going to new lands not as an obligation, but as an opportunity. Unfortunately, fate struck him again. In Iceland, his name was once more tied to murder and he was exiled again. But this exile would open the door to a discovery that would change his destiny and perhaps ensure his son's place in history. Because when Eric was exiled, he turned his eyes westward, beyond the world people knew, to lands that had never been touched. And here came the moment that would change the course of history. Eric the Red took his bravest men and set sail into the unknown waters of the ocean. Storms, hunger, unknown currents. But in the end, he made his discovery. Before him lay a land with lush valleys, rugged cliffs, and deep fjords. He named it Greenland, the Green Land. People say the name was a deception, but Kjell Erik had to convince people to settle there, and the Vikings believed that where there was courage, there would also be prosperity. Thus, the first settlers arrived in Greenland. Stone houses were built, farming was done, and animals were raised. But this wasn't an easy life. The climate was harsh, and nature was unforgiving. But the Vikings were always ready to push their limits, and in their blood there was always a desire to go further. Leif Erikson was born into such a world. He was not only the son of a warrior, but also the son of an explorer. He grew up hearing his father's stories. In Greenland's wild nature, he was raised listening to the legends the wind told. And one day he too would become a great explorer. But where would fate take him? Would he be able to go beyond the limits his father had reached? Well, Leif's real adventure was about to begin. My children, now we're getting to the heart of the story. Leif Erikson wasn't just the son of a great explorer, he was a man who carved his own path. But every journey has a reason, and every discovery has a beginning. Leif's decision to sail west wasn't made out of nowhere. It was the result of ancient winds, the deep call of the ocean, and the legends that had been told. So, what was it that drove him to those unknown waters? Let's first seek the answer to this question. Leif had grown up in the shadow of his father, Eric the Red. As he roamed the harsh cliffs and icy valleys of Greenland, he was raised on the stories his father told. His father's courage and stubbornness had etched themselves into Leif's soul. But in Leif's heart there was more than just the anger of a warrior. There was a curiosity that chased after the unknown. He wanted to win victories not just with his axe on the battlefield, but with his eyes on the horizons. According to sources, Leif Erikson's journey wasn't a coincidence. Like other Vikings living in Greenland, he was constantly forced to battle nature. The land was tough, farming was hard, and the sea could turn on them at any moment. That's why, for Vikings, searching for new lands wasn't just an adventure. It was a fight for survival. The settlers in Greenland hadn't found the green land his father promised. Winters were harsh, crops were few. Maybe Leif was searching for a new hope. But it wasn't just necessity that called him. It was rumors, too. Yes, in the Viking world, rumors spread as fast as the wind. When a man spoke of unknown lands, the story would be passed from mouth to mouth, eventually reaching the ears of the bravest. And it was one of these stories that changed Leif's fate. It was said that a man had been carried by storms into unknown waters, and there he had seen an entirely new continent. That man was an Icelandic merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson. Bjarni wasn't an explorer, nor was he a warrior. He was a merchant, a man who saw the seas as trade routes. But sometimes history uses not only courage, but also chance to make the greatest discoveries. Bjarni's story started with a mistake. When he learned that his father had moved to Greenland, he set out to find him. But along the way, he was caught in an unexpected storm. The winds carried him into unknown waters, and after drifting for days, he saw lands no one had ever known. But Bjarni was a merchant, not an adventurer, so instead of stepping foot on the new shores, he turned around and went back, telling others what he had seen. But for the Vikings, this story wasn't something to be forgotten. After all, the desire to conquer new lands had always been in their hearts. And when Leif Erikson heard this story, the fire in his eyes was lit. Bjarni had been afraid to explore, but Leif wouldn't be. He was different from his father. Eric the Red had been forced to go to Greenland because he was exiled, but Leif wasn't exiled. His explorations came from curiosity, not necessity. He wanted to see new lands, find the unknown, and carve his name into history. And so Leif Erikson decided to sail west. Just as his father had discovered Greenland, he would discover a new world. He prepared his longships, gathered his bravest men, but fate had a twist. His father, Eric the Red, had wanted to join this journey. However, he had to back out at the last minute due to an accident. Perhaps this was a sign from the gods, for the honor of discovering a new world would belong only to Leif. And so the great discovery began. My young friends, now I'll tell you about the moment when Leif Erikson and his men first set their eyes on new lands. Imagine being tossed around at sea for days, maybe weeks, watching the endless blue of the ocean, seeing nothing but that vast horizon, the cold wind stinging your face, your ship battling the waves, and then, one morning, through the sea mist, a new world begins to emerge. Leif and his men had finally sighted land. They were excited because no Viking had come this far before. Even his father's discoveries hadn't reached this point. The land they saw before them was unlike anything they had encountered. It was cold, harsh, and wild. They later named it Helluland. In the Viking language, the name means land of flat stones, describing the harsh nature of this place. So where was this place? Today's historians believe that the land Leif Erikson first reached might have been Baffin Island in Canada. Even today, this island is known for its rugged nature, icy cold climate, and vast stone plains. It had no forests, no fertile lands for farming, only harsh cliffs, strong winds, and a sky tinged with gray. The Vikings had hoped for a new paradise, but what they found was only ice, stone, and desolation. Leif Erikson and his men went ashore. They carried axes, swords, and curiosity in their eyes. The sailors carefully began to examine their surroundings. The land was tough. There was neither a place to plant crops nor a fertile valley. Aside from a few seals and polar bears in the distance, there was almost no life to be found. They began asking themselves, was this a place to live? It was decision time for the Vikings. Leif's men dug into the earth, probing the hard stones with their hands. Maybe a handful of seaweed, a few stunted shrubs, but there were no animals to hunt, and there wasn't the right material to build shelter. This could not be a home for the Vikings. Leif gazed into the distance. He wasn't an angry warrior like his father, but as a leader he had a sharp mind. He knew that wasting time here would be pointless, because the Vikings were not a people who spent time on barren land. They were seafaring people who fought to survive, settling on fertile lands when they found them. And so Leif gave his orders to his men. We won't stay here, we sail further west. The Vikings returned to their ships. They took one last look at the harsh cliffs of Helluland. Maybe they could set up a short-term camp here. Maybe sailors could use it as a harbor to shelter from storms. But the Vikings wanted more. And so, guided by the wind, they set sail westward, hoping to find new lands. Little did they know what awaited them, because ahead there was a much different, much wilder land. My young friends, listen carefully. Leif Erikson and his men, leaving behind the harsh cliffs, cold winds, and gray horizons of Helluland, sailed further west. For the Vikings, there was always more to discover. There were people who always set sail toward the unknown to satisfy their adventurous spirits. Days passed and they traveled under the guidance of the stars through long nights. And then one morning, a new land appeared. This land was very different from Helluland. It wasn't just ice and rock. On the horizon, magnificent forests stretched along the coastline. On the shores of the sea, trees, dense and dark, grew in a way the Vikings had never seen before. The chirping of birds could be heard, and the wind whispered through the branches, creating a sweet hum. This new land they called Markland, or the Land of Forest. So where was this place? Today, historians believe that Markland could have been the Labrador Peninsula on Canada's eastern coast. The wild nature of Labrador today helps us imagine the landscape that Leif Erikson saw: dense forests, vast rivers, and cold sea winds. For the Vikings, this land was a great blessing. In the Scandinavian world, trees were highly valued. Places like Greenland and Iceland had very little timber. The Vikings needed long, strong trees for shipbuilding, house construction, and even heating. Markland was truly a treasure trove. Leif Erikson and his men carefully disembarked, their feet now stepping onto the soft, damp earth after Helluland's harsh rocks sank into the rich soil. They armed themselves with axes and ventured deeper into the forest. They encountered pine trees, birch trees, and perhaps other types of trees whose names they didn't even know back then. Was this place suitable for settlement? Maybe, but there was something even more important. It offered the Vikings a great wealth. Leif and his men didn't stay long. This was not a place to settle, but it was a point of resource. Still, the Vikings could not ignore the riches it offered. They examined the trees, selecting the sturdiest ones, and began chopping them down. They stored the wood and loaded it onto their ships. They thought they could revisit this area in the future for timber. But remember, my young friends, the Vikings didn't just set out to gather resources. They had the spirit of discovery within them. They were curious about what lay ahead. If Markland was so rich, what could be further west? And so, Leif Erikson called his men back to the ships, his eyes fixed on the horizon as they set sail westward, because fate would lead them to the most extraordinary lands they had ever seen. But that, my friends, is the beginning of another story. Ah, my young friends, now I will tell you the story of a land full of legends, wealth, and abundance. Leif Erikson and his men, leaving behind the forests of Markland, sailed toward new horizons. Where would the sea take them? How much farther would they go? No one knew, but the Viking spirit was never afraid of venturing into the unknown. And then, one morning, under the red light of the rising sun, a new land appeared on the horizon. This land was unlike any place the Vikings had seen before. It wasn't like the icy barrenness of Helluland. It wasn't like the dark and wild forests of Markland. This was a completely different world. The land was green, the trees stretched endlessly. Bird songs blended with the sweet breeze of the wind. And the most striking thing, abundance. Leif and his men carefully stepped ashore. As soon as they set foot on the land, they could feel the richness beneath them. The soil was soft, moist, and fertile. The surrounding nature resembled a paradise garden. One could easily live here, grow crops, and raise animals. But what truly surprised the Vikings was the wild grapevines they found. They had come across many fruits before, but they hadn't expected to find grapes, such a gift from nature, in such a distant land. Grapes were a fruit that grew in the warmer regions of Europe, but here, wild grapevines sprawled everywhere. Leif and his men named this fertile land Vinland, or the land of grapevines. For the Vikings, grapes weren't just a sweet fruit, they were a valuable resource for making wine. This discovery meant great wealth. If grapes grew here, life was possible here. But this place was not just about grapes. The land had a much milder and softer climate than the Vikings were accustomed to. The winters were not harsh and the summers were long. Game was abundant. Fish swam in the lakes and rivers. Leif's men realized they could easily make a home here. This was a true treasure. However, despite how much the Vikings marveled at this paradise, they did not stay long. Their true goal was exploration, and they wanted to return and share the news of this land with their people. Leif Erikson stayed in Vinland for a while with his men. They explored, tried to understand the land, and built simple shelters with the tools they had. They hunted, discovered the land's treasures, and most importantly, they etched the abundance of Vinland into their memories. But Leif knew greater things awaited them. Vinland was just the beginning. They had unlocked the doors to a new world, but what lay behind those doors? Well, that is the beginning of another story. Ah, my young friends, the fertile lands of Vinland had enchanted the Vikings. Leif Erikson and his men were certain that there was abundance in life here. But a Viking doesn't just set sail to explore. To settle in a place, to put down roots and build a new life, is also a part of the Viking spirit. And so, following Leif's footsteps, others began the first attempts at settlement in this new world. A few years after Leif set foot in Vinland, his brother Thorvald Eriksson and other Viking adventurers started looking for ways to stay longer in this new land. Building a camp, constructing shelters, and cultivating the land were the foundations of a major settlement. The Vikings began constructing shelters near the coastline. With the axes and saws they brought, they felled large trees, shaped wooden posts, and built longhouses. The camp started to grow, simple huts, fenced-in safe areas, food storage, and perhaps most importantly, a shipyard where they could repair their ships. But this was more than just a shelter. It was an attempt to create a Viking colony. They wanted to settle here and build their own world. For centuries, the presence of Vikings in America seemed like a mere legend. That is, until the 20th century, when archaeologists made a discovery on the northern shores of Canada, in Newfoundland. The area known as L'Anse aux Meadows is considered the first and only known Viking settlement in America. The traces uncovered during excavations confirm the stories of Leif Erikson and his men. Archaeologists found stone foundations of the Viking longhouses, remains of nails and ironwork, ashes from the hearths, axes, chisels, and iron nails used for ship repairs. All of these indicated that the Vikings were not just trying to establish a temporary camp for a few days or weeks, but rather attempting to create a long-term settlement. But perhaps the most interesting find was the evidence suggesting that the Vikings were not alone here. These lands, as it turned out, were not empty and unclaimed as they had assumed. The native people, the Skrælingers, the first inhabitants of North America, were also present. This encounter signified a new challenge for the Vikings. But that, my friends, is the beginning of another story. Ah, new lands, new hopes, and unknown strangers. For the Vikings, exploration was not just about facing nature, but confronting the unknown. The forests and shores of Vinland carried not only the northern winds and the sea, but also the voices of other people. Leif Erikson and his men didn't stay long in Vinland, but those who followed him lived long enough to leave traces of the Vikings in these lands. And it was then that the first contact took place. The people the Vikings called the Skrælingers were likely from the Algonquin or Inuit peoples, but to the Vikings they were entirely foreign. Their clothing was different, their language incomprehensible, and their weapons, boats, and way of life were nothing like the Vikings were accustomed to. We don't have concrete details on how the first encounter unfolded, but the old sagas tell a mixed story of this initial contact. Some sources say the Vikings and Skrælingers observed each other from a distance at first, without direct conflict. The Vikings had noticed that the local people were wary and tended to flee. Perhaps this showed that both sides were frightened of each other. The sagas claim the first contact started with a trade exchange. The Vikings exchanged iron knives, pieces of fabric, and other valuables for furs and pelts from the locals. It seemed like a peaceful beginning, However, other accounts say this peace didn't last long. The Vikings by nature were warriors and conquerors. Perhaps some viewed the native people as weak and tried to assert dominance. Or perhaps a misunderstood action created a rift between the two groups. According to some sagas, the relationship between the Vikings and the local people soured due to an unexpected event. One Viking may have accidentally killed a Skraeling, or the native people saw the Vikings' iron weapons as a threat. Whatever the reason, the peaceful relationship quickly turned to hostility. The natives launched attacks on the Viking settlements. Arrows, spears, and axes flew through the air. The Vikings realized that this new world was more dangerous than they had expected. And so, the Vikings' adventure in Vinland didn't last long. This new world was not meant to be theirs. Though they resisted for a while longer, they eventually had to board their ships and return home. But this story doesn't end here. The Vikings were the first Europeans to set foot on the American continent. And even though they couldn't establish a permanent colony here, their traces were not lost. Centuries later, archaeologists and historians uncovered these traces. And so, my young friends, the story of Leif Erikson and the brave Vikings continues to echo on the stage of history. Ah, my young friends, sometimes a journey begins, but at some point we approach the end of the road. The Vikings' adventure in America is such a story. At first, they boldly and courageously stepped into this new world, but in the end, the changing winds of fate called them back. Now let's examine the conclusion of this journey together. The Vikings' first contacts in Vinland, though initially exciting and peaceful, gradually became tense. The Skraelingers, the native people, were foreign to the Vikings' worldview. They had lived in their forests and deep oceans for thousands of years, following their own rituals and ways of life. However, the Vikings, by stepping onto another culture's land, had tried to impose their own rules. At first, the conflicts between them may have started with small misunderstandings. The trade between the Vikings and the native people slowly turned into mutual distrust and disagreements. The local people feared the Vikings' crowded and powerful presence. For them, the Vikings' iron shields and long swords were seen as a significant threat. On one side, the Vikings' desire to establish power in the new lands clashed with the native people's instinct to protect their land. The sagas describe how this first contact eventually escalated into violent conflict. The Vikings at times had to arm themselves and fight. In those moments, the native people struggled to resist the Vikings' large numbers and iron weapons, but they still put up a strong fight. But my friends, the issue for the Vikings was not just external enemies. Internal problems also grew more significant. The lack of manpower and sustainability issues were key factors that made the Vikings' stay in America increasingly difficult. When the Vikings arrived in Vinland, they didn't have a large number of people. Leif Erikson and his men had embarked on a great journey with a very small group. Their numbers were insufficient to gather the necessary resources and establish a permanent settlement. A group of sailors, a merchant, and an exploration team were too small to create a lasting colony in such vast lands. Moreover, the climate and environmental conditions they encountered were harsh. Vinland's nature, while seemingly fertile, wasn't as easy to manage as they had hoped. There were fertile lands, perhaps, but they lacked the workforce required to make the land sustainable in the long term. Farming, providing enough food, and building shelters required many more people than the Vikings had. In the long, harsh winters of the region, the Vikings began to lose strength. The settlement they had once bravely established grew increasingly isolated. The severe winter conditions, famine, disease, and dwindling resources left the Vikings in a state of helplessness. In the face of all these challenges, it became inevitable for the Vikings to decide to leave Vinland. More conflict with the local people, lack of manpower, and sustainability problems made it impossible for them to remain. Yes, Vinland became a symbol of their great discoveries and courage, but their adventure there ended due to both natural and human limitations. Perhaps when the Vikings decided to return, they asked themselves, would another land be enough for us? Indeed, the search for new lands had become a subconscious quest for the Vikings. But Vinland, despite its grandeur, became a world too distant to belong to them. And so, as the Vikings left America, their great discovery would remain a fleeting moment in the stage of history, but they left behind a legacy that would inspire future nations. Ah, my friends, sometimes a journey is completed, but the real question is what you leave behind when you look back. Leif Erikson and the Vikings, after taking a great step with the discovery of Vinland, arrived at a major turning point. But upon returning to Greenland, they left behind not just geographical discoveries, but a deeper legacy, the hunger for exploration and the courage of the human spirit. Leif's return from Vinland actually held much deeper significance. His time in Vinland, while reflecting the adventurous spirit of the Vikings, was also the beginning of something more for them, a desire to explore beyond just land. When Leif returned to Greenland, he became a true leader. Leif Erikson wasn't just a sailor, he was a leader. After returning from his journey to Vinland, his leadership in Greenland grew stronger. Under his leadership, the Vikings of Greenland weathered many hardships. But life in the harsh, cold conditions of Greenland also meant that leadership carried a heavy responsibility. Leif Erikson became a figure who guided his people, leaving behind a legacy that would be remembered through history. However, one of the greatest challenges to Leif's leadership was the fading of interest in his achievements in Vinland over time. The importance of his discovery of Vinland gradually became less of a focus as time went on. The Vikings were no longer able to continue the search for new lands. The reasons for this were complex. Vinland, while it may have carried the great hopes of the Vikings, also led them to shift their focus to other goals. However, the reasons for the cessation of further exploration were much deeper. Leif Erikson and his successors had come to realize that their initial discovery in Vinland was only a geographical leap. Now the old Viking spirit was waiting for them in another form, the dark, unseen dangers behind great discoveries. First, for the Vikings, it was not as easy to make these new lands sustainable as it had been to discover them. The journey to Vinland was a great success for them, but once they returned, the ongoing discovery of new lands and creating lasting settlements was much more challenging in practice. The shortage of manpower, the harsh climate, food shortages, conflicts with the native people, and transportation difficulties all played a role in preventing further exploration. Second, over time, the Vikings themselves became occupied with other priorities. The discovery of the land and the first settlement in Vinland initially sparked great curiosity, but as time passed, the task of not only holding on to these lands but making them livable turned into a need for the Vikings to build a more organized society. This was a challenge they didn't want to take on. New settlements meant new risks. Another reason was the growing prominence of the Vikings' identity as sailors and their culture. The seas had always been a realm for adventure, but later, returning to their homelands and settling down was in direct contrast to the Viking way of life. For leaders like Leif Erikson, the constant desire to explore sometimes gave way to a longing for security and stability at home. Finally, my friends, the Vikings returned to Greenland, and their decision to settle there revealed one of the most defining aspects of their history. These people, who set out with a great sense of exploration, had confronted certain limits and, under the shadow of the unescapable chains of the past, could not fully escape them. For Leif Erikson, Vinland could have been a point on the world map. But the deeper reasons for the halt of further explorations reflected both the nature of humanity and the conditions of the world. And so the legacy of Leif Erikson was shaped by these brave journeys that left a mark on history. The light of exploration once illuminated distant, dark lands, but over time the inevitability of return and the limits of human existence were acknowledged. Vinland, as part of Leif Erikson's extraordinary legacy, would remain a memory forever. but there were other stories waiting beyond it. My friends, as we delve deeper into time, it's easy to see just how powerful the echoes of the Viking stories resonate. The Vinland saga is not just about a piece of land, but a symbol of the Viking imagination, courage, and thirst for discovery. However, this saga became not only a part of Viking lore, but also deeply embedded in the minds of medieval Europeans. Over time, Vinland transformed into a legend, though one shrouded in illusions and tales that have continued to intrigue us to this day. Though the Vikings were courageous sailors, warriors, and explorers, their stories and myths still hold an air of mystery. In their time, they believed that every event and journey had its own saga, its own tale to tell. Vinland undoubtedly played a significant role in these sagas. One of the most famous written records from the Vikings, the sagas, contains many details about the location of Vinland and the explorations of Leif Erikson. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red are among the most important sources documenting the Viking voyages to Vinland. In these sagas, Vinland is sometimes portrayed as a land of freedom and abundance, while other times it's depicted as a place where people fought against the wild forces of nature. The journeys to Vinland symbolize the Vikings' bravery, determination, and adventurous spirit. Under Leif Erikson's leadership, the Vikings made their first steps into Vinland, discovering wild grapevines and fertile land. The richness and bounty of these lands filled the Vikings with an even greater desire to explore further. However, the sagas also imply that these lands were not always as accessible and understandable as they might have initially seemed. Today, as we read these sagas, there are uncertainties about how real Vinland was and how accurately the Vikings' discoveries were depicted. However, one thing the sagas make clear is that Vinland was not just a place to the Vikings. It was also a symbol of a great dream and pursuit. Yet, the Vinland saga, which began within Viking society, transcended its origins and became a significant idea in the minds of medieval Europeans. The Vikings' presence in North America transformed into a legend in the European imagination. Throughout the Middle Ages, many rumors and theories about America surfaced. The Vikings' discovery of America became a mystery for Europeans, who began to view it as a tale or epic. As time passed, the stories evolved and reshaped. In the Middle Ages, the people of Europe knew very little about America. In truth, information from distant lands like Vinland often took shape through great curiosity and imagination. Many Europeans began to create various stories about the lands the Vikings had discovered across the Atlantic. For many, these lands were believed to be a new paradise or a source of riches. But the line between reality and myth was long erased. Many medieval Europeans dismissed Vinland as nothing more than a fantasy. However, Vinland truly existed, though understanding exactly what it represented for Europeans came later in a different story. Over time, rumors, discoveries, town tales, sailor accounts, and the observations of different cultures mixed together, creating a narrative that both questioned Vinland's existence and imagined it. At first, the Viking journeys to Vinland seemed almost forgotten in Europe. However, centuries later, archaeological finds and oral traditions brought the Vikings' presence in the region back into the spotlight. Excavations in the 1960 S at Las Meadows in Canada confirmed the Vikings' traces in America, and these lands became the proof of this great historical discovery. This finding demonstrated that the Vikings had reached Vinland and once established settlements there. Today, the Vinland saga is not just a memory of the past, but a symbol of humanity's great search and cultural heritage. The first Viking settlements in America continue to remind us of the reality behind these legendary journeys, like a voice lost in the layers of history. Vinland stands as both a geographical discovery and one of humanity's oldest adventure and courage myths, continuing to inspire people even today. And so, the Vinland saga, though buried under centuries of silence, has remained a story that is resurrected with each new generation. The first Viking traces in America have become a symbol of humanity's great desire for exploration, transforming into a legendary tale retold across ages. Ah, my friends, if we are to speak of the Vikings' presence in America, we must also talk about the archaeological discoveries that have brought some of the long-lost traces of the past into the light, from the depths of the earth. Time sometimes erases the human memory, but the land holds the traces of everything. Excavations and discoveries illuminate not only the history of a people, but also the unknown aspects of human history. The findings that show the Vikings stepped foot in America are not only evidence for historians, but for all of us, opening our eyes to the past. Exactly 60 years ago, in the 1660 excavations in Newfoundland, Canada, made a monumental mark on history. L'Anse-aux-Meadows was recorded as the first Viking settlement in America. The discoveries here made the reality of Vinland tangible. L'Anse-aux-Meadows emerged from history as a forgotten Viking settlement. An archaeological dig with stones, iron rods, and various objects pulled from the depths of time seemed to speak the voice of the past. A Viking camp was found here. This settlement was proof of the Vikings' brief but significant presence in America. These finds, traces of people who stepped onto these lands in a distant time, acted as reminders of time's long-forgotten years. The objects found, flint stones, iron tools, jewelry, and sewing needles, clearly demonstrated that this settlement was indeed Viking. Wooden structures and stone foundations showed the area where the Vikings had set up camp, and the craftsmanship of the carpentry presented the expertise of the Vikings. Through these evidences, it became clear that the Vikings were not just a myth, they were truly the first Europeans to reach America. Although the area of L'Anse-aux-Meadows only left a trace of Viking settlements, those traces allowed history to be rewritten. The first people to arrive in America had managed to leave a memorial etched in the earth thousands of years later. This settlement was proof of how deep the Vikings' seafaring culture ran. This people, who dared to venture beyond the sea, not only mastered shipbuilding but became pioneers of exploration. Beyond the archaeological evidence found at L'Anse-aux-Meadows, many other important discoveries have come to light. Viking maps and stone inscriptions. These inscriptions serve as documents recording the Vikings' presence and life in America. The Vikings were a people ahead of their time. Though they left no written records, they expressed themselves through inscriptions carved into stones and rock surfaces. The maps and stone inscriptions proved the Vikings' presence in America, not only through oral tradition, but also through visual and written traces. These inscriptions can be seen as the marks left by the Vikings as they explored new lands and established settlements. The inscriptions were often written in the Scandinavian alphabet, and many Viking stone inscriptions contain notes about Vinland. However, fully deciphering these inscriptions has taken time, and some still hold their secrets. Many of these stone inscriptions not only helped us understand the Vikings' way of life, but also provided geographical clues about the lands they discovered, giving historians hints to pinpoint where exactly Vinland might have been. These stone inscriptions and maps offer us a deeper understanding of the Vikings' explorations and their connection to the lands they encountered. And now, years later, thanks to these archaeological findings, the acceptance of the Vikings' presence in America is not just a historical confirmation, but a way to immortalize a people's courage and wisdom. As we search for the lost traces of the Vikings, wandering through lands forgotten by time, we follow their footsteps once again. The excavations at L'Anse-aux-Meadows presented one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the Viking settlement in these lands. However, the stone inscriptions and maps whisper that their discoveries were only the beginning, and the mystery and exploration go much deeper. The Vikings' presence in America perhaps most powerfully reminds us that humanity can only understand a fraction of what was learned about these lands centuries ago. The evidence of a lost people in the depths of time, like a hidden history, promises us more questions and further discoveries. The fact that the Vikings were among the first to set foot in America will remain an indelible mark on the pages of history, and we will continue to uncover their story even today. Modern-day humans. We can only understand the flow of time and humanity's paths by looking back into the past, but there is also the thought of an alternative reality. What if the Vikings had stayed longer in America? This could be a path lost in the past, the place where another history might have begun. When we ponder these possibilities buried in the depths of history, we realize how fascinating the universe of possibilities for humankind can be. Sometimes, pivotal moments in history can change with just a single step, and the Viking story in America could very well be one of those turning points. Now, my friends, let's push the limits of our minds and think beyond the ordinary. What if the Vikings had stayed longer in the Americas, unable to leave? Historians have approached the idea of the Vikings creating permanent settlements here in various ways. If Viking settlements had managed to maintain a long-term presence on the American continent, it could have shaped the future of the continent in an entirely different way. The Vikings were not only seafarers, but also a people skilled in land conquest. Had they been able to stay longer, the course of world history might have been altered. What kind of world would we live in today if the Vikings had settled in the Americas? First, the influence of the Vikings wouldn't have been limited to the lands of the continent. Social structures, cultural impacts, trade routes, and even wars might have taken on an entirely different direction. The Vikings might have continued to spread their culture, language, beliefs, and way of life across these new lands. This would likely have resulted in a new kind of interaction with the indigenous peoples of the Americas, perhaps leading to either a blending of cultures or, conversely, conflicts. This could have been a pivotal moment in history, as the places the Vikings reached might have led to the development of civilizations in a completely different dimension of history books. Many historians argue that for Viking settlements to become permanent, they would have needed more power and resilience. In the wilds of the American continent, had the Vikings managed to stay, they might have established settled communities, engaged in agriculture, continued shipbuilding, and developed stronger ties with Europe. Their maritime skills could have opened up new trade opportunities, allowing them to interact with different regions of the Americas. In this alternate reality, the Vikings might have left their mark on the continent, forging lasting relationships with the native populations. Of course, all of this is just an alternative history scenario. The Vikings would likely have faced many obstacles if they had been able to stay in America for longer. First, the interactions with indigenous peoples, even if peaceful, would have tested both sides' resources and resilience. The Vikings weren't just seafarers, they were a people with a tough culture, which might have made them more resilient on the American continent in the long run. But sustaining peaceful relations with the native peoples would have required constant balance. Another major obstacle would have been the Vikings' limited manpower and resources. Even the Vikings who settled in Greenland were unable to maintain their settlements once resources dwindled and the harsh winters took their toll. The discovery of America would have required a stronger military presence, and insufficient resources would have made establishing new settlements difficult. Had the Vikings had enough manpower and supported resources, they might have explored more parts of the continent and stayed for a longer period. And so, my dear friends, we come to the end of this deep journey into Viking history. The Vikings, who were the first to step foot on the American continent, etched their history and culture into time in an unforgettable way. Perhaps, had they stayed longer, the world's history would have followed a very different path. However, in the end, reflecting on the beginning of a historical journey and imagining what might have been only deepens the mystery of the past. As we follow the traces of the past, what we must do is not just observe what has happened, but also think about these alternative realities lost within historical events. The Vikings were a courageous and determined people who explored the world. Perhaps their journeys offer us larger lessons and opportunities. Dear friends, let us not forget that to delve deeper into the depths of time and uncover the unknowns of the past, we must continue our journey. Until our next discovery, farewell.